Should we tell everybody what's going to happen, Bronwen?
Let's do it. Yeah.
This is going to be a great comparison of basically how provenance farming practices impact not just cheese, but also craft chocolate. So it is fantastic if you've got the cheese and if you've got the chocolate. Thank you very much. It's not the easiest thing to do. But if you don't, I think it's okay, isn't it, Bronwen? Because we're going to have lots of other interesting chats, which we're going to have.
Yes.
Other glasses of stuff to have. If you've got wine, that's a very good idea. Beer, I suppose, is okay. Tea is good. Water's good. Do ask as many questions as you feel like in the chat. If you've got some coffee beans, they may help at the very end. It's really, really good if you've got a phone, says he dropping his, because that means you can basically tell us what you're thinking of and answer some of the questions. And again, just to sort of keep reiterating, we are recording this. So if you don't mind, just to sort of let you know that. I mean, your faces will not be there, but we are going to record it so that people who couldn't join in can sort of come in there. Right. So let's just get this warmed up. So Menti, as you probably, if you come to any of our other tastings, you know we use quite a lot. But this gives us just a rough idea as to what's happening. And there is a quiz at the end, so you get lots of prizes. So, Bronwen, I think the answer for you on when did you last eat some cheese, presumably it's earlier today, and it definitely is the same for me. So I'm going to be on that one when I get it. And the number you need is 2488. And you only need this once. And the other thing is that that's all you need. So
I am. Earlier today.
Yeah, so I'm there too. Let's see what the rest of everybody's like. I presume actually there'll be some people who aren't going to be earlier today. I'll be very impressed if everybody is on earlier today. That will really be quite impressive. I think everyone's now going to impress me. Okay. Well, this is a good
our work here is done.
Yeah, we're done. Well, we're done. All right, let's see if we can get the same on chocolate.
Ooh.
Okay, so I don't know what the stats are for chocolate and cheese. Well, I don't know what the stats are for cheese, but I do know what they are for chocolate. For chocolate, it's 1 in 4 Brits eat chocolate every day. It's like 3 out of 4 eat it every 4 or 5 days. So this is a better than average audience, which is well. Let's see what's the equivalent for cheese. Do you know how many Brits eat cheese every day? Or
I do not. I do not actually, and it would be fascinating to know how it compares with chocolate. My guess is that it's probably about the same as cheese. Would be my guess.
Yeah,
a staple.
Yes. Right. Let's get to the serious stuff. Look, we always do this because it's basically sort of part of what craft and artisan is all about. But with coffee, despite the fact that we spend a lot less money on coffee than we do on chocolate, and I guess on cheese too, we are much more aware of what goes on because we can all sort of get the difference between instant, and then we can sort of go out and have a nice Starbucks or have a nice Costa's with roasted beans and all that sort of stuff. And then if we're lucky, we can go and visit one of James Hoffmann's great sort of coffee establishments and have some really great specialty. But when it comes to cheese, it's not quite as easy, is it? Well, I suppose it's relatively easy in some ways.
It's, but it may not be as easy as chocolate. And, when I was searching for my examples for this, it was really a thought-provoking exercise because I wasn't immediately quite sure where I was going to draw those lines. And in the event, I think I got them in a place that I'm happy with, but I'd really like to hear from other people whether they agree with me. So I'm just going to take you through my definition of good, better, and best. On good, we have well-made commodity cheese. Philadelphia is the benchmark cream cheese. It goes on the bagels in the Percival household, and I'm not afraid to admit that. But at the same time, it is very much a commodity. It's something that if I buy Philadelphia in the United States or I buy it in London, I know I'm going to be having exactly the same experience, and I also know it's going to be really cheap. And I know the farming will be acceptable to legal standard, but I don't know much more than that about where the milk comes from, what the cows are eating, how the animals are treated. In my better category, I have a cheese with a rind, and this is a cheese that we actually sell at Neal's Yard Dairy. It's a cheese that is thermized, so the milk is heat treated, and it comes from a farm that is not on the same side as the cheesemaker. And I would say it is a really good example of a yummy cheese that's very much a reflection of process rather than farming. It's got a white mold coat on it that is very healthy looking and alive, you can see, but it's got one one breed of mold growing on the outside. It is very much a monoculture, and it has a very nice, rich, buttery flavor, but it doesn't have a huge amount of complexity. It's a cheese of process rather than a cheese of farming. And then on the right-hand side, I have one of the cheeses that we're tasting tonight. And I think it is a reflection of a new generation of farmhouse cheesemakers. And by farmhouse, I mean people who are farming their own animals in a very interesting and unique and environmentally sensitive way, and who are making cheese in a way that, rather than obscuring the quality of that milk or the character of that milk, they're actually doing it in a way that augments or like reveals the character of the milk. So that's really, that's my gradations right now in 2021.
That's really interesting, actually. So I think that's really helpful. I mean, it's very helpful to me because I've never thought about it in those ways. I mean, and it's interesting that your better though is something that you would sell, because when we come to chocolates, let me start with the easy stuff and let me sort of start backwards, because I think at the high end, the sort of stuff that you were talking about, which is that it's not just about the way in which it's crafted, but it's also about knowing where the ingredients come from, and it's all about respecting the bean and the process. That's what craft chocolate, I think, is all about. So, if you take even a product with inclusions, so even in inverted commas, Pump Street, amazing chocolate makers, Chris, Joanna, absolutely fantastic. But this is also a riff, because this is actually, in some ways, some people would sort of say, well, this isn't a classic chocolate because it's actually got inclusions in it. It's got sourdough and sea salt. But actually, the way in which they make it and the way in which they work with it is very, very different. And we'll go through this a bit later. But what we sort of think about is actually the difference between this sort of stuff and actually this sort of stuff is actually very, very minor in many ways. From an ingredients perspective, this is clearly a bit better. But in terms of processing, they're actually processed in a very similar way. And in terms of trying to figure out where the beans come from and the ethics and the environmental aspects of where the beans come from, they're pretty much hand in hand. I mean, I guess where we would sort of say the difference is, this is basically sugar. It's over 55% sugar, and it's then got a load of other stuff in it. This is sort of arguably slightly better ingredients, but it's still, it's nib roasted. It could be made out of couverture, which we'll talk more about later. Whereas, the stuff that we're about, in exactly the same way you were talking about, it is all about basically the expression of the bean, the maker showing you how you can craft different things, and then using different inclusions as well to sort of work in different ways. But you're all here to do a tasting. So the first thing we're going to do is basically talk a bit about tasting, because we'll see in a minute, because we always use Neal's Yard as the great examples of cheese DJs and basically getting everybody to taste.
All right, so now we're going to do that most unfortunate exercise of tasting cheese on camera. And I'm trusting that you'll have cheese in front of you and will be following along and doing the same thing as I'm doing, or I'm not even going to think about you, just standing here and watching me. Fortunately, Spencer is here to provide more.
I'm your guinea pig on this.
Excellent. So I thought it might just be worthwhile taking you through the process that I use when I taste hard cheese. And I'm talking about this in a sort of technical capacity, but I think it also applies to tasting and enjoying cheese at home. Not that you have to follow a very rigid protocol whenever you're having some cheese from a cheese board, but at least by breaking it down into some different steps and encouraging you to look at different aspects of the process, maybe you'll think about some stuff that you didn't before. On the left-hand side, I just thought for reference, it would be interesting. This is a picture of a cheese iron with some Lincolnshire poacher on it. And I took this picture a few years ago at a tasting at Lincolnshire Poacher when I wanted to post about it on Instagram, hence the little icon in the left-hand corner. But it was basically, this is a device a little bit like an apple corer, which you use to sort of plunge into the cheese. You turn it a time or two, and then you pull out a center core of the cheese. And it's a really handy thing to use because it lets you take some of the cheese to taste without actually having to cut it open. When you're dealing with a 20-kilo cheese, cutting one open to see how ripe it is a pretty expensive endeavor. So we use a cheese iron when we're tasting cheese technically. I think it does allow you to taste the right amount of cheese to get a real good assessment of it. And it's something that we can sort of simulate from a cut piece of cheese very easily. So my steps in how to taste hard cheese. First of all, I hope that everyone tasting their cheese has brought their cheese to room temperature or a cool room temperature. It doesn't need to be actively warm, but it shouldn't be fridge cold, or you're going to be locking away a lot of the aromas that you're looking for when you're tasting. Then the next step I would say is, and if you are lucky enough to have the Neal's Yard Dairy selection of cheeses, I think let's do this with Haas Wensleydale just to begin with. Take a piece of cheese from that, just cut a piece of cheese off about the size of a hazelnut. give or take. And the first step that I do, and when we're tasting, we'll just grab a little piece off the tip of the iron, but the first thing I always do is squeeze it between the tips of my fingers. So start to deform it between your fingertips. And this actually gives you a ton of information about this cheese. It lets you know how broken down is the curd. If the curd is very fresh, like the cheese is only a few days old, you'll find that it has the texture of sort of little nuggets that break apart, like little curdy, rubbery bits, like a pencil eraser. And it takes a long time for those pieces to come together between your fingers. The riper the cheese is, or the more fully broken down it is, the more the enzymes have digested the curd, released the flavors and aromas, the easier it's going to be to mush it up and for it to come back together as a sort of pliable bit. Now, I've really worked this a lot at this point. Usually I would do, 2 or 3 little smushes, but really just enough to bring it together. And already my brain is processing that information. Next step, smell the aroma. So just see what you can get from it. It doesn't have to be a deep smell, but just give it a sniff. And you're looking for sort of butteriness, or you can sometimes get very like savory aromas, or sometimes animal aromas, or if there's a defect in the cheese, and actually we sometimes do find defects in the cheeses that we're buying, sometimes you can get this really butyric smell if a cheese is blown, which means that gas producers have inflated the cheese while it's maturing. That can have the aroma of sort of baby vomit, but it's very, very pronounced. And even when you get it close to your nose, you'd be like, wow, that cheese is blown, and you don't even have to put it in your mouth, which is a great advantage in those cases. Or you can get very ammoniated scents or whatever. So anyway, you've smelled the aroma, then go ahead and pop it in your mouth and just press it between your tongue and the roof of your mouth and explore the micro texture of the curd that's broken down. Some cheeses, even when you've already mashed them up, can have a little bit of a sandiness or like a graininess to them. Other ones can have like a fattiness that coats the roof of your palate. And other ones can be just silky smooth and dissolve really cleanly. So again, this is telling you about this cheese, about the stage in its maturation, about how it's changing. I don't think we have time to go into all the details of what correlates to what, but I think just exploring those textures on the roof of your mouth, you get to experience them in a different way when you warm the cheese between your fingers, mashed it up, and just let it dissolve there. Then, given that your mouth has some cheese in it, you think about the flavor that you're experiencing. So, the basic flavors: acidity, saltiness, savoriness, like umami, sweetness, bitterness, all of these can be present in different cheeses. And some cheeses have all of them operating together. So, for example, in the first cheese, in the Haas Wensleydale that we just tasted, I'm getting a fair amount of like zingy, lemony acidity, some sort of creme fraiche aromas, but we're going to get onto that. Acidity, it's not too salty, I would say. There's a hint of salt, but enough for it to taste seasoned without actively tasting the salt. I don't find it hugely savory. Sometimes an aged cheddar can really have a lot of very, very meaty, brothy flavors. This doesn't have that to me. It's not a sweet cheese at all. And to me, this cheese sometimes can have a hint of bitterness. I don't find this wheel particularly bitter. It's just quite a sharp acidity there. And then the aroma, is it, I get a lot of buttery notes from this. Yeah. Is it long lasting? Does it fill up your headspace, or is it quite short-lived? Does it come and go quite quickly? Is it complex? Do you get lots and lots of different aromas, or is it just one note? For me, again, and we'll taste this cheese together in a minute, perhaps in conjunction with a little bit more information about it. I think this has a really, really nice lactic, buttery flavor. I find it a little bit one note at the same time. And so after you've swallowed it, just think about how long is the impression of this cheese. I can still taste it now. I wonder how it will compare to some of the other cheeses we're going to taste later on. And then finally, last but not least, did you enjoy the cheese? Always pause to think about that. So there you go. Cheese tasting in however many steps.
I really like that. I've never actually thought about sort of pressing it to the roof of your mouth and seeing how that works. But I definitely agree with you that the way in which the taste and the flavors come through is definitely there. I think there are lots of parallels here to chocolate. Not least, one of them, I think, is that it's not the way I expected to do it. So, but I just do want to sort of stress to everybody that Bronwen and Neal's Yard are the heroes here, because basically, a bit like nobody ever bought music before they heard it on the radio. The great genius, I think, of Neal's Yard is that basically you go into their store and they're just wonderful about giving you so many different samples. Anyway, which we've struggled to do in chocolate, which is the reason why we love these tastings. Right. So with chocolate, the chocolate I want you all to try and grab, I'll just show it to you very quickly, is the Willys, if you've got it, which is the little gold one, which hopefully you'll also be getting a couple of other tastings. And open it up. And then we have a slightly different protocol to the protocol that you normally read about, and we'll go through it. But the most important thing, actually, when you're trying a piece of chocolate, the first thing you want to do is snap it. And you want that loud snap because it's been properly tempered, and this is going to help you get the first bit of the flavor as it comes through. There is an argument that you can sniff it, and depending on the weather and depending how hot it is, it's definitely worth doing it. A little bit like that Bronwen got you to basically sort of, smudge some of it through your fingers. That actually is a good idea with chocolate. For two reasons. One of which is if you basically can get it to melt, you will release more of the volatile. So it's much, much easier to get a smell through that. The second thing, though, is that basically it'll show you whether it's got cocoa butter in it or not. So if you rub it between your fingers, it should disappear. If it disappears, that means that the cocoa butter has basically done what cocoa butter normally does, which is why it's sort of, used in cosmetics. It's dissolved in. If you basically took one of these and you rub that between your fingers, you'd be there for about 3 hours because it's basically vegetable fat and PGPR and loads of other stuff. There is one other thing, though, that we really, really are fans of, which we try and encourage people to do, which Bronwen and I are going to do live, which is that you're going to take a piece of chocolate, you're going to hold your nose, and then you're going to stick it on your tongue, and you're just going to suck it. Because this is one of the best ways that we know. So if you can all just do that and just enjoy. If you come to one of our big tastings, we force you to do a lot more than this. But basically, you won't asphyxiate. You can do this for quite a long time. But it's a phenomenally good way of actually explaining to people the difference between flavor and taste. Because if we've now got it there, it's been melting, you can chew it a bit if you want. But what should suddenly happen when you release your nose is you should suddenly, and you sort of like pretend you've run 100 meters and you're breathing in and out, what you should suddenly get is this whole range of aromas coming through. Because what's happening is that the chocolate is releasing its aromas. And then you are able, because you are a human being, and human beings are uniquely in this attribution. We can do something called retronasal olfaction, which is a very fancy way of saying that we can actually smell or detect flavors, not just through our noses, but also through our mouths. We lack something called a transverse lamina. All other animals have actually got a transverse lamina, or virtually all other animals you've ever heard of, like dogs, cats, horses, all that sort of stuff. They can only really get smell and tastes. So, I mean, the basic taste, sweet, sour, salty, umami, bitter, arguably fatty as well. Those are completely different to what we think about as being flavors. And chocolate obviously has got both of them. Cheese has obviously got both of them. But this aspect of chocolate, when it basically releases flavor, is absolutely fascinating. And I'm just going to, do one more thing before we go any further. And I don't know, I'd be intrigued to know if this sort of works as well for cheese. We developed this with James Hoffman and Barry Smith, the professor of philosophy at London University. James is the coffee guy and Rebecca Palmer's the wine person. And what they pointed out is that when you enjoy something like a coffee or a wine or a chocolate, and I think the same is also true of cheese, it's not so much just a sort of those flavor wheels that you get. There's actually a journey that you go on. So the first thing you actually want to think about, exactly as Bronwen was sort of saying, is the texture. And how does it melt in your mouth in the case of chocolate? And if any of you have ever had a stone ground chocolate, you'll know what I mean by a grainy chocolate. If you haven't, come to one of our regular stations and you'll get one of those. But then what happens with chocolate, at least, is that you release the flavor and it's sort of like having a wave crash all over you, because chocolate has got this extraordinary set of complexities, at least cocoa beans, proper cocoa beans do, when they're allowed to sort of bring that stuff out. And this is the great fun bit of chocolate. And hopefully you've all got in your packs one of these flavor waves, because as we go through, we'd love you to basically taste the different chocolates and sort of get your impressions of them. The other thing I would say, though, is that one interesting aspect of chocolate flavor is that most people will get the same initial aromas, those initial bursts. And it's quite interesting to compare them. But what's interesting is that as the chocolate melts in your mouth, what it's actually doing is not just melting, it's also interacting with, just to get technical, your saliva. And people's different salivas have got different enzymes in them, and that releases different bonded volatiles. So you will actually get different flavors from one another. And that's one of the reasons why we like to get people to actually compare what flavors they get when they talk about the different chocolates or the different wines or the coffees or cheeses or anything else, because it's actually really interesting to see it. The other reason is just very simple, which is that we're all very used to describing a piece of music. We're all very used to being able to sort of, describe colors. With something like chocolate, or I guess even cheese, we lack the vocab. So often it slips away. And then we've also got the Langman. Anyway, if you're into flavor, we're going to do another whole session on flavors with chocolate. You're getting a sort of mini version of it here. And do come to those. We're going to start them off in a couple of weeks' time. But anyway, should we just taste a couple of chocolates and explain what we're going to taste? So as you probably all know, chocolate grows on trees. It grows in a slightly wacky way. It grows out the trunk of a tree. A couple of times a year. You have all sorts of different varietals of cocoa pods. So just as you have different sort of, wine varietals like, Syrah or Pinot, you have the same with cacao. The thing that we're going to be exploring today is what we call fermentation. And fermentation is, one of those sort of things which, you learn about at school, then you completely forget. But actually, it's the secret to almost all great foods and drinks. It's that thing which actually creates the initial flavors. So if you've ever had the misfortune to have a cocoa seed, you will know it is incredibly bitter and astringent, and it doesn't resemble cocoa at all. The magic is actually fermentation. And you can control fermentation in lots of different ways. So we're going to take the chocolate of a Great Dane. This is one of Europe's greatest chocolate makers, a fantastic guy called Mikel for his Holland. And I managed to get the bean origin wrong here. It's actually a Tuno. But you should all have 2 bars of chocolate, one of which I am now missing. You should all have 2 bars of chocolate, one of which is basically double turned and one of which is triple churned. And I'm going to try and explain to you what the difference is. What I'd like you all to try and do is, if you can, please grab the double turn and just try a bit of that. And again, the format is, hold it up, give it a good snap. Do give it a sniff, rub it between your fingers a bit if you want. And then just basically put it in your mouth and just enjoy savoring it, and breathe in and out through your mouth a bit if you can. So what we're first going to try is the double turn. And while you're trying that, try and remember some notes, and I'm going to ask you to put those notes down in a sec. But I'll come back to that in just a sec. What I'd like to try and do is just explain to you actually what fermentation is and what Mikel means by a double turn. So what happens when you basically open a cocoa pod is that it immediately reacts with different yeasts and bacteria and stuff in the air. And the pulp is this incredibly sweet, lovely, delicious stuff, which you can actually make drinks out of. But it starts to react with those enzymes, and you get various different chemical reactions. You first of all get an aerobic one, you get an anaerobic one. But fundamentally, what's happening is that it is breaking down the skins of the seeds and turning the seeds into cocoa beans. And depending on what different bacteria and microbiomes you've got in the area, you will get radically different flavors from that. But it's not just actually the different yeasts that will create this. It's also a question of actually how long you ferment for and how hot it gets. And so what double turn means is that if you can see in the middle of those pictures, there's sort of those wooden boxes. What double turn means is that about halfway through the 5-day process, it's turned 2 times. So oxygen is allowed in, that cools it down a bit. So what I'd love you all to do is just basically, it's quite subtle this, but just basically, if you can just basically detect any notes you get from the double turn, and then try a bit of the triple turn, which is hopefully the same colors, but the other way up. And they are quite similar, but I think also quite distinctive. Yeah, I definitely agree on the double turn being quite honeyed. It definitely has those notes. It's also a very, very rich and buttery texture in my mind as to how you pull through it. We've got an awful lot to get through, so I'm actually just going to invite you. And the one thing that Mentimeter is not always quite as quick as it can be. So scribble on your piece of paper. Brilliant. Cherry, vanilla, silky raisins, milky. Yeah, definitely agree with all of that. It's sort of, Mikel will shoot me for saying this. It's quite mellow as this one ends. You don't get a huge amount of difference, I don't find, from how this one goes. Whereas I think when we try the triple churn, which is exactly the same bean, grown in exactly the same place, harvested in the same way. Mikel has also crafted in exactly the same way. So he's roasted, he's conched it, he's used the same longitudinal conch, everything else like that. The only difference literally is how many times during the 5 days of fermentation that has actually been turned and aerated. So it's the cooling down, the adding of a little bit of aeration. which brings it in there. It is. I mean, you're being very kind to whoever's saying astringent. You are right. You could almost describe it as actually having almost like a slightly metallic note to it. But I definitely agree with that. To me, it's also got, it's a little bit sharper as well. But it also, yeah, much more coffee. Absolutely agree with that. But it just goes to show, I mean, and this is exactly, I think, what Bronwen was talking about earlier on, which is just what we're all about is basically trying to get people to appreciate just how this magical element of whether it be milk or whether it be the cocoa bean can just produce these extraordinary flavors and textures when it's well crafted. Right, okay, let's move on because we've got to get through quite a lot of stuff. Cheese selection. Okay, Bronwen, you are on.
Absolutely. Okay, so the sneak preview into the life of a cheese buyer, I suppose, is that when do we ever put these technical tasting skills to use? I would say the place where I taste the most cheese is when we visit the farms where the cheese is made, and we go through the process of tasting all the different batches that are made over a period of time, whether it's a month or 2 months or 3 months in some place, when there are places that are far away and we might have to taste through 3 months of production. But essentially, what we're trying to do by doing this, and I think this is something that sets Neal's Yard Dairy apart and has for many, many years, is that we recognize that there is a lot of variation from batch to batch in these, artisan and farmhouse products, where you're dealing with a lot of different factors that are changing from day to day. It could be differences in the microbiome of the milk, like Spencer was talking about, what bugs are naturally present. A lot of these cheeses are made with raw milk, so there's no pasteurization step that's going to flatten out that microbial community. And the whole process of cheese making is about amplifying all of those microbial communities and allowing them to produce the enzymes that make all these different flavors. So we like the fact that there's variation from batch to batch. If there wasn't, our jobs would be very, very boring, and we should at that point be selling them on supermarket shelves. But these are not cheeses that lend themselves to that sort of model. And Spencer says it's very kind of us to offer tasters, but I think it's really critical to our entire model of selling. And really the ultimate expression of what Neal's Yard Dairy aims for in terms of the way it sells cheese is that picture that he showed in an earlier slide of the interaction across the retail counter, where people get to then taste the cheeses that we've selected and decide for themselves on the day what's tasting best. And, my job when we go and visit the farms is to taste through those cheeses, identify ones that are going to be particularly good, and definitely select away from cheeses that have faults developing in them, and then make sure that those are the cheeses that we buy. So on these 2 pages, you can see a fairly recent tasting in July of Pitchfork cheddar and Montgomery's cheddar. And down the left-hand column are the dates of the cheeses that we tasted. And then a quick note that I took on each of those, and then a score. The scores that we give are very, very flattened. Basically, a 4 is good, a 4- is not very good, a 3 is actively faulty, and there are occasionally 2s and 1s that are in the spit out carrot class, but those are very rare. And then also the scale should go up to 5, and I never will give a 5 because at that point I will have to put down my cheese iron and retire. So then you can see in the column to the right of the score, there is a tick mark next to the ones that we have that I've selected. So usually it starts with a comment about the texture, just like we were talking about. That's based on what I'm feeling on my fingers and on my tongue, and then into the flavor and aroma aspects of it, which are really in the order that I experienced that. But really, I think the key thing with a lot of this is you have to be working at speed, and each one of these cheeses probably takes about 30 seconds. So if you slow down too much, you start to realize how much cheese you're eating, and it's no fun anymore. So I'm happy to answer any questions on cheese selection, but it's just to show you the context in which we taste, and also to reiterate that because these are agricultural products, and because, even if you were to do the exact same thing to each of these cheeses, to make each of these cheeses every single day, and the make didn't vary at all, they would still be tremendously different. But layered on top of the diversity of the raw materials, because of all those factors, is the diversity of the cheesemaker, how long, what their judgment is, how long they choose to, heat the curd for, whatever, based on their, on their intuition and on their experience. And that lends another layer of difference from day to day.
Wow. And well, first of all, congratulations on having such wonderfully clean handwriting. But how big are these batches when you're trying them?
It really depends on the cheesemaker and their scale. So at Pitchfork, they have a smaller vat, and they usually are making about 10 to 12 cheeses per batch. At Montgomery's, it's a slightly larger vat, and depending on the time of year, they'll have different amounts of milk. So they're making all of their milk into cheese. So it basically means that the number of cheeses varies depending on the time of year and the season. But in general, between 16 and 18, 24-kilo cheeses in each batch that we're tasting there.
And are you trying each batch or are you trying each cheese?
We're trying each batch. And that does bring up an interesting question about to what extent tasting one sample cheese from within a batch that's all made from the same vat of milk on the same day and theoretically subjected to exactly the same factors, there's variation within it. And the answer to that is sometimes there's quite a lot of variation from cheese to cheese within a batch. And so we recognize that for some cheeses, like Montgomery's, the selection gets us to the first stage, but then there's a whole nother level of selection that happens when we bring that whole batch into our arches in London, where we store them for their final few weeks before they're sold, where actually our cheese team goes through and often will taste every single cheese before allocating it to a different customer.
Wow. Okay. That is definitely beyond what we do. We're very fortunate that our makers making reasonably large batches of, 100, 200, 500 kilos, sometimes a lot smaller, but there we go. Right. Now you're going to explain to us what happens and what gives us all the flavor.
So I think I'm really interested in looking at cheese making as a reflection of our opportunity really to taste a farming system. And this is something that has come about gradually over the course of the 16 years or so that I've worked at Neal's Yard Dairy. When I began working with cheese, I think the conversation was really about how the special thing about artisan cheese was that it was made on a very small scale by an individual, not a machine in a vat. And I think that that is special and that is different and it's worth celebrating. But at the end of the day, like I was talking about in my lanes of, commodity better best, I think that there is another and extraordinarily important layer there, which we're just beginning to understand and explore. And that's about how cheesemakers are the best cheesemakers are farmers. Let's put it this way. So, and cheesemaking is farming on these three different scales. First of all, they're farming a landscape. So they are tending a variety of fields that they're going to be using either to graze their animals or to produce forage for them to eat during the winter. And so obviously that's the way most of us think of farming, is growing plants in the ground. But then there's also farming of animals themselves, these animals that are then giving us milk. So I have a picture here of some, let's see, next slide, Spencer.
Sorry.
Yep. Of some cows. And of course, the choice of cow is a very important one, not because different breeds of cows magically give fantastically different tasting milk. I think that's much too simplistic a way of looking at it, but certainly as we have learned more about milk for cheese and what makes good or interesting milk for cheese, I think the importance of that breed of cow is ability to thrive in an interesting place. And I think we're going to talk about that more a little bit later, but certainly it's farming for animals, obviously, choice of animal, choice of environment, and getting your milk from that animal. And then finally, cheese making is farming on a microbiological scale. So here's a picture of some yeasts and molds taken by my friend Ben Wolf at Tufts University, who is a microbiologist who looks at the microbial communities in fermented foods. And really, to be a cheesemaker, you have to be a microbe farmer. And people were farming microbes, making cheese for hundreds, if not thousands of years before anyone knew what microbes were. But if you create the wrong environment for those microbes, you will end up not making good cheese at all. And so you need to be in control of all of the scales of farming if you're going to be a cheesemaker.
Wow. Okay. So
the reason why I think that cheese ultimately is so interesting is that it gives us an opportunity to taste a farming system. And cheese is super clever technology because essentially it takes what is a really, really perishable and heavy, bulky food, which is milk, and it makes it storable for a long period of time, but it also makes it much, much more compact. So cheese making takes the fats and proteins, which have most of the nutritive value, the caloric value, and the energy in that milk, and basically separates them from the liquid fraction, which contains the sugars, and turns it into a cheese, or it turns it into a substance that only takes up 1/10 of the total volume of the original milk. So it condenses it fantastically. And it means that depending on the style of cheese you're making, you could keep it anywhere from a few weeks to a few years. And of course, in an era before refrigeration, that was very, very useful in terms of having this remarkably important foodstuff, which then was able to be consumed in times of famine when there wasn't so much milk around. You keep it for when times are lean, and cheese is a great way of doing that. But more than just being a clever technology, cheese making allows us to taste the character of the milk in a much, much more transparent way than tasting a glass of milk does. So for example, if we were to taste the milks themselves that went into the 3 cheeses that we have on our cheese board, the Hawes Wensleydale, the Wynyates, and the Stonebeck, there would be I think we would probably be able to detect some subtle differences between them, but all of them would taste like milk, sweet, milky, probably a little bit creamy, but not hugely different in terms of their aromas or flavors. But you turn that into cheese and then age it and allow all the enzymes from the milk, from the microbes, from the molds and yeasts and bacteria that are growing on the outside to go to work on those milk proteins and fats. And suddenly you create something that is like a technical expression of the character of that milk. And I think because of that, cheese gives us the opportunity to really detect differences in farming systems. And I think the more that I've seen and the more that I've learned, the most interesting, unique, diverse, and I think this aligns very closely, fortunately, with extensive farming systems. So not intensive feeding lots of grain, but actually eating lots of different plants in a very diverse and unusual place. Cheese has the capacity to transmit that character much, much better than milk does, and perhaps to allow us to reward people who are farming in ways that are more difficult, but more interesting.
And to what extent does the rennet, or whatever it is, which is actually sort of turning the milk into the cheese, influence the flavor?
That's a really good question, actually. So for those of us who don't know, rennet is the sort of magic enzyme that takes the liquid milk and turns it into a solid curd, which is sort of like a milk jello, but it has particular properties which allow the whey, it sort of forms a protein and fat net and allows that to shrink in, and the whey, which is the liquid part, to be expelled. So it's like at the very heart of cheese making. And the type of rennet that's used, I would say certainly rennet does impact flavor, depending on the style of rennet, whether it's a one that comes from the traditional source, which is the stomach of the baby ruminant, whether it's a calf or a kid or a lamb, or something that comes from a laboratory where they have used sort of recombinant DNA technology to essentially clone the protein for that enzyme and produce it in a vegetarian way, or an extract of some like plants, which do also have the capacity to set milk into a gel, like cardoon stamens or some molds can do this. Those all, because they're all enzymes, they go to work on those curds as the cheese ages, just like a microbial enzyme might, and they'll release different flavors. But I would say there are many, many, many more microbial enzymes and milk enzymes that are working on those curds than there are remnants of the rennet enzyme hanging out in that curd. So while it does have an effect, and while some of those microbial rennets, for example, can be very microbial extracts, I should say, and some vegetarian rennets can impart bitterness, I think really it's quite difficult to tell the difference between different rennets in the flavor of the cheese if there aren't faults present, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. So it's not like wine, it's not like chocolate, where the yeast actually does make a massive difference to the fermentation process.
Well, I would say probably that I would compare the yeast to something like the starter culture, and in that case, I would say that it does make it. So the
Yeah.
enzyme, maybe not so much, but the yeasts and the molds and the bacteria, absolutely, huge difference. So I think I'll go ahead and talk you through a tasting of this first cheese that we're going to taste tonight. This is the Hawes Wensleydale. Wensleydale Creamery calls it the Kit Calvert Wensleydale, but if you have packaging on your cheese, it will say Hawes Wensleydale because Wensleydale Creamery is in Hawes in Yorkshire. This was the only Wensleydale. Thank you. This is the only Wensleydale that Neal's Yard Dairy sold when I started working there in 2005. And in fact, until probably 5 or 6 years ago, it was still the only Wensleydale. And it's a very interesting reflection of the state of the industry at that time. Essentially, this is I don't think there's any shame in saying that this is a factory cheese. And the Wensleydale Creamery is the benchmark producer of Wensleydale, or was. They make all, the Wensleydale with cranberries that you get in the grocery store with Wallace and Gromit on the outside. They make 10,000 tons of cheese a year. And they do it all with milk that's collected from a fairly modest radius of the Wensleydale Creamery in Yorkshire. So all the milk comes from within the region. And obviously only a small proportion of their cheese is made in this format with the cloth binding, sort of the natural rind. Most of it is block cheese that is sealed and aged in plastic. But this was a cheese that actually, because back in the early days of Neal's Yard Dairy, there wasn't actually a raw milk farmhouse producer of Wensleydale to speak of anymore. The last farmhouse Wensleydale makers had really gone out of business and stopped making cheeses in the 1960s and 1970s. So there was nothing to sell, and obviously you can't have a shop that specializes in British cheese without selling Wensleydale. It's just one of those benchmark cheeses that you absolutely need. So Randolph Hodgson, who was in charge of things back then, decided that he would go to the people at Wensleydale Creamery, who are absolutely lovely, and commission from them a cheese that was named after one of the people who saved Wensleydale cheesemaking in the region in the sort of early 20th century, Kit Calvert. And the defining features of this cheese are, it's made from the same milk that goes into all of the other Wensleydale that's made at the factory, which means that it's also pasteurized, because it's very difficult to make a raw milk cheese when you're bulking up the milk of many, many herds, because a truth in the cheesemaking industry is that your milk is only as clean as your least clean milk supplier. And so when you're bundling up lots of milk, you got to pasteurize it. And so it's pasteurized, but the make is a little bit slower. So it gives it a little bit of a creamier texture and a rounder flavor than you might expect from one of their Wensleydale cheeses. If you went to the grocery store and bought a piece of block Wensleydale and took that home, that would likely be much more sort of pale, grainy, slightly birdseedy texture, if you know what I mean, that a lot of people associate now with British cheeses. In fact, this creamy texture is probably much more similar to the way these Dale style cheeses were when they were made on farms, and it's just a reflection of the speed of the acidification and the amount of starter culture that they're using. Again, probably for reasons that are not that interesting in the context of this tasting. But what I would say is, this is a big cheese. This is a small sideline from a very big company. And just recently, within the last couple of months, the Wensleydale Creamery has been sold to Saputo, which is a big multinational dairy firm with a turnover of probably 15 billion US dollars a year. So, I mean, this is one arm of big cheese, if you want to put it that way. And for a long time, that was what was available. So taste the cheese. I think we already smushed this one up. We thought about the flavor and the texture and so forth. Let's go on to the next one, because I know that we are running short of time a little bit. Okay, so here we are working on a very different scale, as you can see. This is Claire Noblet making the Win Yates Wensleydale at their farm in Lancashire. And Claire and Tom are a couple who have a hill farm and decided that they were going to make a Wensleydale style cheese. And we started, as I said, buying this cheese, and we're really excited to finally have a raw milk farmhouse Wensleydale to sell 5 or 6 years ago. And again, let's take a piece of cheese, smush it up a little bit. So this cheese, you can tell, and I don't know if we all have the same wheel, but for me, this cheese feels a little bit bittier and a little bit drier than in the way that it's breaking up, a little bit more feathery around the edges. Let's hold that up there. Than the Wensleydale felt.
It definitely does have a different texture.
And when you're feeling it on the top of your mouth, you can really feel those bits. That is, I think, entirely to do with the way the curds are cut. It's a lot more uneven. And also as a drier cheese, that cheese is less broken down, less fully sort of broken down by the enzymes than I think the Haas Wensleydale was for its age. I also find it much, much less acidic, much less overtly lemony than the Haas Wensleydale was, and a few more sort of savory, brothy notes.
Yeah, it's definitely got more umami towards the end, I think.
Yeah. And again, I think it has a little bit more presence. And again, feel free to, anyone who's tasting these cheeses here, feel free to disagree with me.
And Bobby, you can just write on the menti. So if you've still got the number 24880786, you can just scribble and it'll appear on the screen.
Oh, nice. Even on this screen.
Even on this screen, it should do.
Nice.
If you can figure out how to get it to work.
All right. So say you're full of it and we'll all see it. The other thing I would say, we're talking about process and we're talking about farming. And I think from a process point of view, this is a nice cheese that's made on a very, very small scale with a totally different kind of starter culture and with, a lot more sort of slow make handmade methods. The other thing I would say is that actually, even though they're farming their own cows, Claire and Tom are much more, well, they're still fairly conventional farmers, and their farm is probably quite similar to some of the farms near to Wensleydale Creamery. They're farming Holstein cows, which are big leggy cows designed to give a lot of milk. And most of the milk that they make is sold on a liquid milk contract. So a tanker shows up and picks up the milk and takes it away, and it's probably processed into yogurt and sold as liquid milk in grocery stores. And that's great, but it wasn't providing enough money for them to feel secure about, themselves as farmers in this very remote and rugged area. And so that's why they ultimately decided to go into cheese making. I guess my key point here is really, really, really handmade methods, but quite conventional dairy farming, if that makes any sense.
And is the Holstein indigenous? Is that the reason why they picked the Holstein?
It's really, really interesting. Holstein is not indigenous to the UK. It comes from the Netherlands. And the original cows in this area, probably, the idea of a breed is a modern invention, started in the 1820s. But so who knows what people would have been farming a long time ago on these farms, probably some quite scrappy little cows that didn't give very much milk. And ultimately, as the dairy industry improved itself across the 19th century, people gradually started milking shorthorns because they were seen as much better. They were bigger cows, they gave more milk. And then all the progressive dairy farmers in the mid-20th century switched across to Friesian Holstein cows, which are the black and white cows that we all think of as sort of synonymous with dairy farming now, because they were bigger and more productive and really, really these giant tanks that could give loads and loads of milk. So for an example, like one of Tom's cows probably gives 8,000 to 9,000 liters of milk a year, which is quite a respectable amount of milk, even by, intensive dairy farming standards. So they are cows that are designed to make a lot of liquid milk. And as a result, they also require a lot of grain to eat, in addition to the grass and hay and silage that they're eating on the farm.
Got it right. Well, we're on to the third one, which is a great one.
So this is the next iteration of Farmhouse Wensleydale, I think. And it's a project that's been a long time in the making. And that finally we've been able to start selling their cheese just near the end of last year. A couple called Andrew and Sally Hatton in the Yorkshire Dales. And it's really been a sort of, I think Andrew really, really wants to farm, and he really wants to farm in an interesting way, interesting animals in a very out of the way place. His passion is these Northern Dairy Shorthorn cows. And the Northern Dairy Shorthorn is very interesting because it is the indigenous breed to this sort of very mountainous, hilly area. And because we don't have a Holstein picture to show next to them, it's probably hard to tell how small these cows are, but they are very compact, very rugged, designed to look after themselves first and make milk second. And to be honest, probably not not capable, they could never make 9,000 liters of milk in a year. And in fact, on the pretty much all forage, all grass diet that Andrew and Sally are feeding them, they're getting about 1,800 liters of milk a year. So probably only 20% of what those Holstein cows are making elsewhere. And this is a cheese that's very interesting because, again, their project is about maintaining and building the plant biodiversity and all the other kinds of biodiversity of birds and insects and so forth on their farm in this area of outstanding natural beauty in Yorkshire. And so the cheese, more than anything else, is just a means to an end. Andrew said, I saw what was going on with farming and agriculture and how dependent we were on subsidies. And I thought, if this is going to be sustainable in the long run, we've got to stand on our own 2 feet, and making a cheese is going to be the kind of thing that could ultimately allow the farm to exist happily without subsidies, if the cheese could be good enough. So the interesting thing about this cheese is that the method of making it is a little bit different from the Wingates, but not really. I mean, it's both processes, they both use the same starter culture, so the same bacteria are added to both. Obviously, the Wingates and the Stonebeck are both made with raw milk, so a lot of what we're tasting in each of them is the microbes in the milk. But you can feel that the texture of this one, as you smush it up, is way, way, way softer than the Wingates. And part of that may be that it's a little bit higher moisture, but I think most of it is down to the fact that when you feed cows essentially an all grass diet, the fatty acid distribution of that milk is very different. So this is a cheese that's much richer in polyunsaturated fats, which then, like olive oil versus butter, are much softer at room temperature. So that's an impact of the cow's diet on what we can taste. And I hope that you'll agree with me that the flavor and aroma and complexity of this cheese are next level compared to the other ones. And I think really 90% of that, at least, is in the farming and the difference in what the cows are eating and where the cows are living.
It is extraordinary. I mean, it is an extraordinary complex cheese, which really, really just lasts and lasts and lasts.
Yeah, no, it's like a crescendo as opposed to a sort of nice little phrase.
Yeah, it's sort of, it's the exact opposite to our wave, actually. It's sort of it keeps going. I mean, but I think there is something about that because of the way I think that the fat sort of stops you getting some of the acid and therefore some of the taste and some of the flavors until a little bit later. It is, which cocoa butter doesn't appear to do, which is a bit strange.
That is interesting. It has more of a sort of, you have to wait for it a little bit more maybe because the fat is there.
Yeah, the fat definitely takes a bit longer to get some of the taste and flavors, I think, coming through. I'm very, very conscious of the time, so I don't know how much time I know that you've got quite a hard slot, so I'm going to rattle through.
Please, sorry.
You just need to quickly just do the. I think you talked a lot about this.
I think basically this is just to recap a lot of these ideas about tasting a farming system and how those farming practices that are extensive and low yielding are inherently more expensive. And it's only when the cheese quality and cheese taste reflects that we can hope that ultimately it's going to be worth more money and support those farming practices in the long run. That's it.
Okay. So just quickly, look, this is where the similarities are very, very strong. Basically, everything that happens on the farm, everything that happens, which the maker does, makes a massive, massive, massive difference to what goes on with the chocolate. And what we're going to try and do is basically explore 2 different things. So the first thing we're going to basically invite you to do is we're going to basically explore 2 different chocolates made by different makers, different parts of the world. One in the US, Brian Graham from Fruition, one in France. Well, actually lives at the moment in Belgium, but he's making in France with Bonat, a guy called Bertil Augustin. It's his beans that we're actually going to try. And then we're going to show you the impact of percentages and basically how the recipe works a bit for the chocolate maker. I'm going to very, very briefly try and give you a little bit of a crash course as well as to what's happening, but also to go back to Bronwen's earlier point about how can you actually tell good, better, best when you look at different chocolates. So the first chocolate I'd love you to try is the Fruition Madagascar. This is a relatively recent one of Brian's bars. He's only been making beans with Bertil's estate for about the last 3 years. It's the Bajofo estate. I will explain more what I'm talking about in a minute. Basically, the grinder and the conch which is used here is something called a McIntyre, which is very different to the grinder and, well, the conch at least, which Bonat uses for Akkersen, which is what's called a longitudinal conch. And then the oven is also very, very different. And it's these steps. The first, I mean, basically, the way chocolate gets crafted, as I'm sure you all know, is you basically, if it's proper chocolate, you get the beans, you sort them, you then roast them, then you basically have to get the shells off them because they don't taste particularly good, and then you basically winnow them. And I'm not kidding, this is actually, what many chocolate makers will start with when they start to winnow, which is a vacuum cleaner, because basically the shell is lighter than the bean, the nibs, which is what the bean becomes. So you actually separate them like that. But what is really, really difficult for people to actually grasp is that when you take a product like this or like this, it is actually made in a completely different way. It's basically, most people who make chocolate, for example, this company, Presto, don't actually make chocolate at all. They do what we would call assemble. It's basically a bit like a restaurant. Take McDonald's, the way in which basically it's all centrally processed. Its chicken nuggets are centrally processed, its hamburgers are all centrally processed, and literally the guy has to do is split the hamburgers. This sort of chocolate is basically made with something called couverture, which is Belgium's great contributions to the world of chocolate, which is basically chicken nuggets for chocolate. And that's what this stuff is in the middle. Most chocolates that you will eat in the UK are made with couverture. It's processed liquor, which has been done somewhere outside of it. And it's one of the reasons why whenever you look at a bar of chocolate or a bar of chocolate like this, they can't tell you where it's made. The next big difference between chocolate, and this is sort of applicable to these sorts of chocolates, is they may well actually be making the chocolate themselves, but they will be roasting the nibs, not the beans. That is much more efficient. You're going to get anywhere between 3 to 8% higher yield if you roast the nibs, not the beans. But roasting the nibs means you take the shells off. That basically means that you cannot get the flavor. So it's just starting in the wrong place. Now, what's interesting about chocolate makers is that they can actually experiment with all sorts of different roasters. So I'm just showing you two different here, but they will use all sorts of different roasting approaches. So Brian Graham, for example, he's an ex-chef, ex-CIA. That's the Culinary Institute of America, by the way, not the CIA, the other ones. But basically, he uses a lot of ovens that he used to use as a chef, and they're mainly convection ovens. And for example, Chris Brennan out of Pump Street has some intriguing ways of using the fact that he was a baker in lots of his ovens there too. But other people just use a drum roll. And here we actually do see the difference between the two chocolates that we're going to have. So just basically, the difficulty we face in chocolate, and I guess it's the same in cheese, and we're going to go through that in a minute, is it's very obvious when you see a roast chicken and a chicken nugget how different they are. But for most people, when they look at a set of bars of chocolate, it's incredibly difficult for them to work out what is what. And one of the things that we are desperate to try and get people to do is to basically start paying attention not to what's on the front, not to the pretty packaging, but actually to look at, first of all, the ingredients. And it'd be interesting to get Bronwen's perspective here, because I think with cheese, it's slightly different. We sort of said this with crap chocolate, you can actually very quickly tell that the ingredients are rubbish. So, for example, if you get a dark chocolate, even one of these, which has got vanilla in it, you know that they're basically hiding the fact that it doesn't have much flavor. Whereas if you take, Pump Street, or if you take Ackerson's, or if you take, any of the 100 or so makers that we've got, and you look at the ingredients, it's really simple. It's just going to say cocoa butter, cocoa solids, sugar, and milk. The other things, though, that you really, really, really need to look at is just basically, where do the beans come from? This is what I think that, wine has done a phenomenally good job of doing. You can argue that coffee's done a brilliant job of doing that. I don't think chocolate actually does a very good job of this, to be brutally honest. They're getting better, but a lot of makers just don't tell you enough about where the beans come from, because just basically telling you that it comes from Madagascar or it comes from Peru. Paddington comes from Peru. That doesn't help him find where he's got to go. It's the same thing with chocolate. You've actually got to know the estate of it. And then also figure out where it's being made. Right, let's get back to tasting the chocolate. So I'm hoping that you've all tried the chocolate. And while you're doing that, I mean, basically, the same thing for you, Bronwen. How do we communicate provenance in the case? Do all be trying this, because we're going to ask you to give us your impressions in a minute. And then, just to rush on, basically try the Ackerson's 75% as well. And just see how you think those two chocolates. And I'm going to try them now and get your impressions in a sec. And Bronwen, you're going to tell us about how do you communicate provenance? Yeah. How do you tell them apart? They all look to be very similar. They've all got bits of cloth around them.
When you photograph them in high definition against a gorgeous Neal Dairy blue background, all of these cheeses look intensely similar. And I certainly, without any other information, would not really be able to shuffle them into different lanes, which, and I think one of the things that's interested me about Spencer's presentations in the past is how he's really identified this as one of the big challenges for the chocolate industry. I also think that it's a huge challenge for the cheese industry. Obviously, nobody is going to mistake Philadelphia for an artisan cheese. And you look at the back of the package of Philadelphia, and you can see that there's a little bit of cynical stuff mixed into that, locust bean gum and so forth, which is an emulsifier, just like some sorts of the lecithins that go into chocolate. But once you get to even a block supermarket cheddar aged, without a natural rind, you're looking at something that's got all of the same ingredients, milk, rennet, starter cultures, salt. That's all that cheese has in it. And so there's not, even when we give full information on the label, a way for a customer just to look at the cheese and look at the ingredients and say, this came from a big factory, or this came from a little farm, or much less, this is how the animals were raised. This is what kind of cows they come from. This is how they were fed. This is how old the milk was when it was turned into cheese. And I think one of the things that I'm very interested in exploring is how we as an industry, as a cheese industry, better communicate the provenance of the products that we sell, because I think now more than ever, people are starting to recognize the importance of the way that products are farmed, and particularly the products of animals, and I'm of the firm belief that animal protein should be, very well produced and very, and appropriately expensive, and that we probably shouldn't eat that much of it. But I know there are a lot of people who do want to, buy according to their philosophy, but we don't do a good job at helping them find the right cheeses for them. And so, one of the things I was hoping that we could use the last few minutes to talk about is how we as an industry, and how, chocolate as an industry, can best communicate that provenance to customers so we find the right customers for the right cheese.
Right, I'm going to push us on very quickly. So again, I mean, if you've got time, if you've got 30 seconds, I would love to get your flavor notes from this. The important thing to note here, and I'll explain to you what this means in a sec, is that in comparison to the way in which Bertil's bar is made, this is actually crafted in a very different way. It's basically, so look, one of the key steps, and the thing which actually made modern day chocolate possible, was an accident, an apocryphal accident, which happened to a bloke called Rudolf Lindt back in the 1870s, who left his grinder on when we came back, discovered this amazing liquid, sort of, Willy Wonka-like stuff. And that is the start of modern chocolate, because before then, chocolate was incredibly grainy. And what he discovered was basically that if you grind it for a long period of time, two things happen. First of all, what happens is that it turns into this amazing sort of smooth, silky substance. But the second thing is that the grinding is a bit like when you knead bread. It basically brings out more of the flavors inside the chocolate, partly through Maillard reactions, because you do get a bit of heat, but that's actually, the Maillard reaction is much, much more a question of actually what happens with roasting, but it is also partly just by injecting oxygen. But there are very, very different ways of conching. So Brian was one of the first people in the States to use this thing, which is called a McIntyre, which is the thing at the top right. Actually, most chocolate makers, believe it or not, use a converted Indian lentil grinder or a spice grinder, generally known as a cocoa tan. And this is actually what made the chocolate revolution possible. But a small number of people have actually sort of invested in repurposed longitudinal conches, and that's what Bertil's bars are made out of. But the interesting sort of thing here is this is actually not Bertil. This is actually not the Bonnat one. This is the Ritual one, because it's what I could find pictures of. But anyway, I mean, look, give us a quick idea of what you thought of Fruition Madagascar, if you can. One thing is that generally Madagascan beans tend to be sort of quite bright and fruity. And having said that, I don't actually think that either of these bars are very good examples of that. But somebody has got up the sour cherry, which I think is right. Raspberry, it is very, very fruity. But sometimes you get it so that literally it tastes as if you're sort of having an opal fruit, but a bit brilliant descriptions. Yeah, definitely agree. So I wish we had more time, but I mean, look, we're going to be, I think we're doing this again at Canopy or in a similar way. And we do also have another tasting that we're going to really do a deep dive into flavor, where we're going to talk about different percentages and different beans and different conches and different roasts with different people. So fantastic. Now let's go to Bertil. That is Bertil with a hangover, hanging out in Madagascar with his sort of, I can't remember what the name of that particular aspect is there, but these are longitudinal and he roasts in drums. So again, I would love to get your impressions of, basically how you think this one works slightly differently. A couple of points. He does use a little bit more cocoa butter. So one of the tricks that lots of chocolate makers do to sort of make something even more luscious. Yeah, I get banana. I also sort of almost got bubble gum in it. But I don't get as much of the bright sour cherries in it, but that just may be me. I get a little bit, I think it's also a little bit more roasted, but it's an intriguing, yeah, it is grainier. It is definitely grainier. I think the beauty of what Brian does with the McIntyre is it does give it an incredibly consistent mouthfeel. Original Beans use a slightly different approach, which is they actually use they use ball bearings to do their stuff. Which is slightly different. I agree with all the stuff that you're coming out with here. And I think it's basically partly down to the conching. I think it's also partly down to the roasting. Now, in the interest of time, because we would love to get more of your feedback too, what we're now going to do is basically show you how recipe makes a huge difference. by recipe, we're actually going to basically assume that really what goes into a chocolate recipe is two things: the amount of cocoa butter and then the amount of sugar that you add to it. So be prepared. If you're not used to having 100%, Bronwen, by the way, is the great queen of 100% chocolate. Whenever we have a new 100%, I basically send it to Bronwen. So when she got her kit from us, she had a couple of other 100% bars in there because she is absolutely fantastic at tasting this stuff. But so this is 100%. I think what you will immediately get is this has got a very, very, very different mouthfeel. And we're going to probably spend more time doing this next time when we do a longer tasting. One quick comment. What you're getting in your mouth when it's drying out is not bitterness, it's astringency. So there's a lot of tannins in chocolate, just as there are in red wine or there are in coffee. And the interesting thing about astringency, it's not a taste, it's not a flavor. What it actually is people argue, but it's basically, what actually is happening is that the proteins in your saliva are basically not coagulating because the tannins are getting in the way of that. But what's interesting is that the human brain is actually quite good at telling people to switch off the sense of astringency. It seems to be a natural warning we have to fruit that isn't right. So if you cast your mind back to the first time that you ever had an espresso or a very, very black coffee, you will probably remember that it was very astringent, but you get used to it and then you can put all the flavors up. So quite an interesting little game to play is if you've got some coffee beans, and we probably don't have time for it now, but you can try it later, is chew a coffee bean and then try some 100% chocolate. Because what it actually does is it switches off the astringency because it's a mental model. The easier way though for chocolate makers to do this is just to basically put a bit of sugar in there. But what's interesting is that sugar is to chocolate a little bit what salt is to meat. The amount you add to it radically changes the flavor. And if you don't believe me, come along to the next tasting where we're going to basically do 70% versus 80% of the same beans. And you would never guess that it's the same bean. Right. What we thought we'd do is a quick quiz now, and there are prizes for the end. So, and then we will basically, anybody who wants to talk, just basically let us know in the chat and we'll open you up. But we'll basically send you more chocolate and maybe Bronwen will send some cheese to whoever wins. And given that there aren't that many of you, there is a good chance that some of you will win. So, right, so we're going to basically start. There are 7 questions. So we're going to have a quick go. And Bronwen and I promise not to answer.
I won't.
Right. So we did mention all the answers to this as we went through, I hope. So which animals can't detect flavors in their mouths? Which one rather can? There's only one which can. Dogs can't, and lions can't either. It is just humans because we lack the transverse lamina. That's the basis to human civilization, because without that, we wouldn't have had cooking or cheese or chocolate, because we just wouldn't have enjoyed eating it. And without food, we just wouldn't have got civilized. So it's all to do with flavor. Now, this is another one. I actually have a terrible feeling I may not have said the answer to this, but anyway, it's a useful question. There's one animal here which actually doesn't get sweetness. This is a taste in this case. It's cats. It's not dogs. Dogs do get sweetness. They need it because they basically will eat things. If you look at it, that's the reason why cats don't sort of like chocolate. Dogs don't like chocolate for another reason, which is what theobromine does to them. Well, they shouldn't like chocolate because of what theobromine does to their stomachs. What do cocoa pods grow on? So we did sort of show you this, and hopefully people will remember it. Trees, vines, bushes, or shrubs. This is just to tell whether or not people have been listening. It is trees, not bushes. Very good though. So we labor this one a lot. I think it's actually quite interesting. I do think that one of the things which will sort of, come out of all of people getting more and more into great foods like great cheeses and great wines is the fact that, we will think more about what is going on in our mouths. It is indeed astringency. Yeah, so whenever you go to have your next curry, just remember that this whatever is the secret to the craft chocolate revolution. Sorry, they're very slow questions. Well done, I've already got it. Yeah, normally get some people saying chilies and spices, which of course don't come from India at all. They come from South America, and they're called peppers because Thomas got it all wrong. Right, Bronwen, you're on. You can read this one. And I hope that I got the right answer.
How much hard cheese will you get from 1 liter of milk in grams?
You did give the answer to this. I was very impressed.
No, I worked at it. Excellent.
Excellent. Well done, everybody.
A really hard cheese, you might get 50 grams, but most that would be 100 grams. Yep.
And the rest of it's sort of whey powder and everything else anyway. Let's go on to it.
What
And this
breed
is excellent. You got this one in. I had no idea, despite living in Yorkshire for a long time, about this.
Wow. All right. Well, cows native to the Yorkshire Dales: Northern Dairy Shorthorn, Holstein, Blue Albion, or White Park. Lovely. All right, Northern Dairy Shorthorns.
Hey, listen, great audience.
Good job. And then the final question. Which of the 3 Wensleydales we tried is not bound in cloth? The Wensleydale Creamery cheese, the Wynyates, the Stonebeck, or all of them are cloth bound?
I like this question. Very good.
All of them are actually cloth bound. So yes, just one more indicator that cloth is not necessarily a, who do we have?
Great answers. Oh, Arno,
Very
just
impressive.
did. Wow, that is very impressive. Arno, you were faster than Valerie, and that's why you got them all right.
Look at that.
There we go. Well done.
Well done.
So, Bronwen, why don't you have a go on this one?
So yeah, when Spencer and I were talking about what we wanted to communicate in this tasting, I think we came up with 2 big points. And I think the whole question of provenance is the big one for me. Both cheese and chocolate allow us to taste both farming and crafting processes intertwined with one another. And I think our successes as an industry is the extent to which we can bring people along with us to appreciate and understand, to kind of speak the language so that they can understand what they're tasting and savor it and hopefully be willing to pay a little bit more for it and reward the work of the farmers and the cheese and chocolate makers who are, working so hard to get us something that's not just a commodity. And then really, I'd love in our final minutes to hear what people think about how we as industries have to this point approached this idea of sort of lane definition of what's what. How do we define what those lanes look like? What's good, what's better, what's best? And how can we, as everything from retailers and wholesalers and middlemen, which is essentially what Neal's Yard Dairy and Cocoa Runners both are, help you as customers identify quality in a way that is interesting and useful and not like a lecture. So I look forward to hearing what people think about that in any way.
So if you want to I'm going to basically either use the chat or we can easily get you to sort of basically speak up. So if you want to speak up, just basically say that you want to speak up and we'll basically open it up. I'll leave that up for us for now. But if you would like to take a stab at any of those, just basically raise a hand, I think is what you can do, or just basically throw up whatever you'd like to sort of say, or else just write to us later. I'm very conscious of the fact that we are over time, as ever. But
stunned into silence. I don't know if that's a good sign or not, but.
So Valerie said, tastings are best. So Valerie, would you, I'm basically going to allow lots of you to talk and just sort of, so just to warn you, some of you are basically sort of I'm asking you to unmute if you would like to.
This is Valerie. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
I just think I've loved Neal's Yard Dairy for 20 years and I've loved Cocoa Runners for about 18 months. And I actually think that doing tastings like this is what means I learn about the quality and the provenance, and that's what's best. Thank you.
Well, fortunately, I really enjoy doing tastings, so certainly Spencer gives amazing tasting. So I agree that having the opportunity and the space to really do a deep dive with people who've self-selected as interested is a really good start and probably gives us far more space.
But I do think it's one of the great advantages that you have as Neal's Yard with your retail outlet. I've just, even before I knew you guys, even before we set up Cocoa Runners, we always bring people who came into town to go to Neal's Yard just because it is the best retail experience I know. It is the closest thing that the food world has to what the music world had with radio, I think.
Well, it's been a real challenge with COVID, actually, to have to go over to a model in our shops where we haven't been able to give out tasters. And I think it has made me, for one, fully appreciate that those tasters are absolutely, like, it's really hard to buy cheese without it.
Yeah. So we will be, I'm assuming if anyone's got any other questions or any other comments, do just throw them, or I mean, basically email and we'll reply to the emails. We'll send you all an email afterwards. A couple of other quick comments. We're probably going to do a slightly different version of this at Canopy Market, but we'd love you to come to that. So Canopy Market is just outside King's Cross Station, up at the Waitrose around there. And it's an open air market. We're going to have about 10 or 12 different makers from all over the UK, craft chocolate makers. We'll be doing lots of different talks. One of them will be with Neal's Yard again. So please, please, please come to that. But there's also ones on whiskey, there's ones on wine, there's ones on ice cream, other great products. And then the other thing is that we do regular weekly tastings about Welcome to the Revolution. Nick does them, and I do them a bit too. And then we are also going to do a deeper dive actually into using chocolate as an example to, or as a means to understand more about flavor and what goes on there. So this was a sort of a slight prep for that. There will be different bars in it, so come along to that. But we really have got some fun and different bars which show you different conching from the same beans, from the same maker, and the different percentages point, and then how milk radically changes chocolate too.
Super cool.
Bronwen, I cannot thank you enough. Hold on, there's Q&A, which we've missed. There's an anonymous attendee, whether or not a mouthful of chocolate and cheese can work together. We've tried, haven't we?
I think we have. And, you know, I would say it's not bad. I might enjoy them myself a little bit more separately.
Yeah,
but,
I think you're being very polite. I think you're right. I think that there is an example of where a mouthful of cheese and chocolate can work very, very well together. But it's called a chocolate cheesecake.
Yes, exactly.
I don't know why it is, but that seems to work really, really well. And look, I love cheese and I love chocolate. And I will always end the meal with some of both. I will generally have my cheese before my chocolate. And I'll generally switch wine. So I generally have white wine with the cheese, and then I'll move on to red wine with the chocolate. But I don't really combine them, except with chocolate cheesecake. So I don't know.
I think there's another question down here as well. Is there anything you see from farms that you think needs to change to improve the environmental aspects of food production? Well, that is a big, very interesting, very important question. And I think, you know, how you measure the environmental. Sorry, I'm not sure if somebody is actually adding to that question. Essentially, how you measure the sustainability of systems is very complex. And a lot of times it depends on what you're privileging in terms of your outputs, how things stack up. So in some ways, if you're just looking at greenhouse gas emissions, for example, a lot of the very intensive ruminant operations where, say, for example, they're milking cows that never go outside and are eating more grains, will say, well, actually, our system is better for the environment because the cows are eating less grass, and because they're eating less grass, they release less methane, and methane is a potent greenhouse gas, and therefore feeding cows more corn is better for the environment. Now, if you look at that in another way, about what the resources needed to farm all of that grain actually look like, because 70% of the grain that's grown in the UK is actually fed to animals, which is quite shocking when you think about it. And there's a lot of not only greenhouse gas emissions that goes into, you know, burning all the fuel to harvest that, or spreading all of the inorganic nitrogen on the ground in, you know, non-organic systems, that a lot of which washes off into our waterways. Like, if you are measuring from that perspective, maybe having cows on an almost all grass diet, while it might release a little bit more methane, has a net impact that's lower. So one of the reasons I think this question is so interesting, and also why it's so difficult, is it's super complex.
Yeah, I think in the case of chocolate, it's a little bit easier, because basically when we're comparing this with this, the big difference is that to grow this, they've cut down the rainforest. And to basically make a chocolate bar like this takes about 1.5 to 2,000 liters of water, which is fine if you kept the rainforest, because it all gets recycled. But, you know, if you take West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire or Ghana, you know, they used to be 50, 60, 70% virgin rainforest. By 1990, they were below 30%. They're now 1 or 2%. And that is disastrous. And it's not just West Africa. It's also what's happening in, you know, Ecuador, since they basically came up with these awful clones, which taste like battery acid. And you do need vanilla to make them taste of anything. And the problem is that the way people are growing it is by basically cutting down the rainforest. And, you know, actually cacao is an amazing crop because it actually encourages massive biodiversity. But Nick is the expert on this stuff from our side. You know, we'll be doing a talk on that too soon. But it's a very, very good question. And Valerie, we will have to try Stilton in chocolate too.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay.
Sign me up.
Bronwen, I promised not to keep you beyond 9:15, and we've managed to go well over that. So I think
I hope my 1-year-old playing a drum solo in the background on the bowls downstairs has not disturbed people's viewing experience. But no, thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed doing this tasting, and I look forward to hopefully Canopy Market in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop that one.